Hi guys, good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to the Growth Design Podcast. With me today, I have my co-host.
Hi everyone, Ini here.
Yeah, good to have you again, Ini. We are continuing the Growth Design Career Playbook series we've been on for a couple of episodes now. And today we have a very exciting guest. His name is Christian. He's a product designer with over 15 years of experience designing for both enterprise softwares and consumers products. Over the past 7 years, he's focused on growth roles and had helped different companies move key metrics through the power of design. Christian believes in simple design, working closely with engineers, testing product often, and building relationship to help design thrive. He has worked with various household names, including British Gas, KPMG, Uptime, McLaren, HSBC, and Google. It's a very great pleasure to have you on the show, Christian.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. So, Christian, before we dive into the conversation, can you give us a more elusive introduction of yourself?
Sure. You've covered most of it. I'll start there, but I'll dive a little bit deeper in. So, as you very well said, I have over the past 7 or so years focused mostly on growth roles, but there is a story behind that. There is a story before that, rather, should I say, where a lot of it comes from my early beginnings in design, which were mostly around writing code. And I started mostly as a programmer rather than a developer. I was never very good. If anything, I was not very good at all, which is probably why I moved away from it. But there was just something about it that made me interested in this thing called tech, in this thing called design. This is late 90s, so quite a long time ago. And I've discovered Photoshop around that time. I've cracked a copy of it, of course, like every designer on that time used to do. So I started playing with it, and then it kind of started all and snowballed from there. And before this whole growth focus started, the work that I was doing was very general. I was working with a lot of different companies, doing really at the beginning of my career what I could get. Perhaps we'll get to talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah.
I talked to a lot of designers about how to start and how did you get where you are today. And the story really obviously is a bit more complicated than that. But at the end of it, I just picked up any single piece of work that I could. And at the point in time, you start learning what you like to work on more, and you start learning where you think you're best at. And what I've seen as these patterns across my whole career of where I was producing good results, but also what I was enjoying doing was really these growth roles. And I'm happy, at a later point to go into what really is growth and how do I define that and what's the difference between growth design and just design. I'm also happy to talk about that.
Definitely.
So, but yeah, that's the story until now. I am working for ZOE now. If you live in the UK, you have probably seen us. We're everywhere. We're a health tech company, really on a path to truly change the life and change the health and improve the health of millions of people. So it's very exciting to be there, and I'm also there in a growth role.
Oh, exciting. You talked about you being a developer before you jump into design. Just like me also, I think I did a little bit of programming, but not quite long before I sort of moved into design. So what was that particular moment that led you into design that you just know that, okay, this is it for me? Like, can you just briefly tell the story around it?
I'll be the first to admit that part of why I became a designer is also the serendipity of being young and getting a computer at the right time and in the right place and getting a dial-up connection as it was back then at the right time and all of that, right? So obviously that played a massive part in what was possible for me at that time. My parents bought me a computer, and what did you do in 99 on the computer? You were through a dial-up connection. It was just not a lot you could do, right? But I was just fascinated by this machine in which, like nothing else, I could just lose myself for hours. And I would need my dad to just pull me off of it to go to bed, right? And I remember when I was younger, I didn't enjoy reading that much. But the deal was if you spend 2 hours on the computer, you have to read for 2 hours. Oh, I'm telling you, I've read a lot of books because I just had to be on this machine, right? So, and then I discovered programming, and it was completely serendipitous moment of being kind of, again, at the right point in time, at the right place. And I've discovered HTML and CSS and started playing with that. But what I've learned after doing that for a couple of years was that it's not that it wasn't exciting for me, is that I kept being pulled towards this other component of it, which was the details, the paddings, all of these small things that might not matter. And I was sitting there and busting my head over just a little line of code, and it would take me so long to figure out. And then that kind of introduced me to someone else at a later point introduced me to Photoshop, right? And that's when I made the connection. That what I really like the most is not necessarily building the thing. It's not necessarily writing the code. It's coming up with the idea in the first place. It was my way of being creative. I've never been good at drawing. I've never been, a musician. I can't play any instrument. Creativity for me showed itself whenever I was in front of a blank canvas and was given a problem to solve. And from there, it snowballed, right? It wasn't like, this is me 15 years later telling you about it, right? It's not how I was thinking back then, but kind of subconsciously, I was so attracted to this idea of starting for a blank sheet of paper, or rather the blank canvas as it was in Photoshop. And then just by the end of 2 hours or however long you have, you produce something. It just felt very interesting to me. Yeah. So I think that was the moment where I realized, oh, this is it. This excites me. I want to do more of this. And then the rest of my teenage years and university and all of that happened off the back of that. I never questioned what I wanted to do because it was kind of like, I love this so much. Why would I do something else? So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious. It's so interesting to know that that's what really got you excited to say, okay, I just want to get to the end of this, which sort of pulls me to the next question in particular. I know that's introduced you to design entirely, right? But the aspect of growth, what drew you to growth design, and what mindset shift did you notice when you begin to work with growth?
What drew me to growth is probably not a question that I can answer entirely, because the reality is that I don't think I was drawn to growth as much as I was led to it naturally through the progression of my career. So what do I mean by that? The first 5, 6, 7, whatever years of my career, growth design was not something that I was considering or thinking about. Someone came to me with a brief, hey, I need a website, or I need a landing page, or I need a product, but here it is. Right. And to me, that's kind of a natural part of how you become a designer. It's early on, you're not going to understand all of unless you have, another education in business that you're coming from, or you won't understand all of these things, right? Design is just drawing it, making it look good. But inevitably, what happens when you become a bit more senior in your career is that you end up in companies that expect more from you, or you get hired for more. You get hired not only to make things look good, but suddenly as part of the brief, you might see things that you couldn't relate to. Increasing conversion, doubling retention. Like, what are all these things, right? So I can't say that I woke up one morning and I thought I want to do growth. It was more the job that I'm sitting in right now and the freelance project that I have, all sort of require me to touch on these other things. You have to do that because it's part of the job. You learn, you get better at it. And suddenly it kind of becomes your thing. That's really interesting. And that at some point you do wake up and you realize, you know what? Over the past few years, I've done a lot of growth work.
Yeah.
But it's like so it's not something drew me to it. It's kind of, that was the natural path of my career. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I get.
Yeah, and I'd say, at which point do you discover that? And I would say there are designers out there today who do that type of work who don't realize that they're doing growth work.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%. 100%. And one of the things I also noticed about you was that you have a podcast, and your podcast is titled Design Meet Business. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about your podcast? Like, what's the motivation for your podcast? Like, what did you see in your career that prompted you to, start a podcast?
So I started the podcast at a time where I've made a couple of realizations. One of them was that throughout my career, I've had a lot of help indirectly from people. It's not like I went to someone and said, help me. It's that person wrote an article, or that person wrote a tweet, or whatever it may have been, that led me to a specific discovery. So I have grown in my career a lot off the back of other people's kindness to share what they knew. So that was one of the things. And then the other one was, I thought there was more of a need of a voice that can talk about what I felt was the natural evolution of design, which was you have to move some metrics here and there.
Yeah.
You have to stop thinking necessarily in pixels only, and you have to see your role as a much more strategic, much wider, much more important in the business. Maybe there were a couple of people here and there, but I felt there was no voice to do that. So with these two realizations happening within a very short period of time, I don't remember exactly what it was, a couple of months, I thought, why not? Why wouldn't I do this? Why wouldn't I be the voice? Not necessarily me, because I'm no expert, right? But why wouldn't I make the effort to invite people on and have them be the voice, give them the platform. And it was born out of my desire to give back to the community, because
Amazing.
I have, over the past many years, as I said, learned from others. Perhaps it's time for me to do some of that for whoever's starting out.
That's really interesting. I love that. I think it's also similar to us also starting this podcast. Apart from the fact that we discovered that there are limited content around growth design, just like what you said, just other than just pushing pixel, there's more to you being a designer. And there is so much content about design, general design, but for specifically about the business of design itself, the growth design, there is none. And I think it's really a good one for you to have led that and share your thoughts. Looking back to your podcast, what have been the tangible benefit that you've observed in your personal life and your professional growth? What are the benefits you've seen starting a podcast?
So I'd say the main one is just getting access to really high-performing, high-quality people and just being able to pick their brain. And coming in super with humility and just saying, I have a lot of questions. Are you willing to be on the podcast? And then they come and then they share their time. They're kind. You don't pay them anything. They just give an hour or 2 hours of their time. And they share a lot. And through what they share, you get to explore how a lot of different companies and a lot of different people think about the same things you think about. So if you ask me one question, I'll give you one answer. If you ask exactly the same question to someone else, I'll give you a different answer. Yeah. And if you ask someone else, they'll give you a different answer, right? And if you listen to all these three answers, you can kind of pick and choose the best out of each and the one that you can relate to the most. So I would say I bring all these people on. And I've had people really high up, whether it's VPs of design, some of the biggest companies in the world, but I've also had individual contributors who I know have done really great work. And by listening to all of these people at a different level and how more or less I kind of ask the same question, not necessarily the same questions, but we talk about the same subject. So you start to see patterns in what do all these people do and think the same, but also what do they do and think differently? And which one of these people do I agree most with? I've had recently someone on the podcast that I thought had very interesting views on growth and all of that. And I can't say I've agreed with that person, but that's completely fine. I'm sure there's someone listening to it who thinks, oh, that sounds great. I love that, right? On the other hand, sometimes I also have guests to whom I listen to and I'm in awe. And someone else might listen to them and think, I don't know, that's kind of BS, isn't it? So what's given me is really access to a lot of people's stories. And through that, you get to kind of create and carve your own way of thinking about design.
I totally agree with you on that. So in every career, there are highs and lows, right? Was there any time where there was a challenge that you thought you wouldn't be able to overcome?
I'd say that if you don't think about the work that you're doing today as a challenge that you can barely overcome, you're perhaps not stretching yourself enough. So I cannot give you one. I can give you plenty of examples in which I thought that. If anything, it'll be easier for me to tell you about all of those where I felt that rather than the times I didn't feel that.
Yeah.
I think that's part of growing. That's part of stretching yourself, is being at the edge of your comfort zone. And I would say there have even been examples in the past of projects or jobs that I've refused taking because they were too easy or I wouldn't learn anything. But I had this other opportunity here that would challenge me a bit more. And I understand not everyone is in that position. That's completely fine. I have a lot of empathy for that. I'm just telling you my story, which is, yes, plenty of time I've been at the edge of what I think I can do. Today, I'm at the edge of what I think I can do. The interesting part is that if you look back on some of these times when you thought, oh, I'm not sure I can do this, if you look back on them today with the brain you have today and the experience you have today, you're kind of going to laugh at yourself a little bit, right? And that's just such a great sign of growth. That tells you that you're on the right path, right? So I have so many examples, and every single one of them I would give you, I laugh at myself at, because that's part of growth, right?
Yeah,
I'll give you an actual example rather than talking theoretically.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, if you just give us just one story that illustrates something like that.
Yeah, for sure. So many years ago, more towards the beginning of my career, where I was invited to an interview for an enterprise software platform company. And the CEO, it was a pretty small company, I think 20, 25 people, something like that. So the CEO was interviewing me, he comes in here, he had a crazy technical background. And he shows me this platform, this software platform. And he walks me through it. And this was, just to give some context, a company that was 10 years old that never had a designer. So everything was designed by developers. So imagine 10 years of developers doing design, right? So it was less than great, let's say. And he walks me through it, and then my brain, after about 15 minutes of him walking me through this, my brain is like mush. I could not understand a lot. And he finishes showing me the platform, and he says to me, "Do you think you can do this?" He flat out asked me, because it was about, a big project that would have been to redesign that, or that's what would have started with. And he looks me in the eye and says, "Do you think you can do this?" And the funny thing and the serendipity of life, no more, and I remember this, I'll always remember it, no more than a couple of weeks before that interview, I have heard this quote from Richard Branson, which goes like this: "If someone asks you whether you can do something or not, even if you don't know, say yes and figure it out later." The serendipity of that, right? And the moment he asked me, "Can you do this?" that Richard Branson quote hopped into my head. And I said, "I can. I'm sure I can." I was scared shitless because I wasn't sure I could do it. It was such a complex platform. He hired me on the spot, which was really awesome. And I can tell you, 2 years later, I've been with him for 2 years.
Wow.
I left because I was bored.
Wow.
So that's an example. Initially I think, oh my God, this is so complicated. I'm not even sure I can do this. And 2 years later, you are at the point where you think, I've outgrown this. It's time for me to move on. So that's one example. But, I have so many. This was very much related to the work itself, right? But when I moved to London in 2016, it was not so much about the work, but rather how easy it's so a new country, a new culture. Can I do this? Right? So you always question yourself. But I always say, if you're not questioning yourself, you're not stretching yourself. Because if I would tell you, I'll give you a mathematic problem, a second grade mathematic problems, would you be nervous about that? Be like, no, I can do a 2 + 5, right? You're not learning much from that. But if I tell you, I'm going to give you a mathematical problem that they can only solve at the highest level of university, would you be a bit anxious about that? You'd be like, oh, yeah, that sounds pretty complicated, right?
Yeah.
So there's these two extremes. And where you want to be somewhere in the middle, but closer to the one that pushes you and stretches you. You want to think, yeah, I think I can do this. There's a chance I can do this, but I'm not entirely sure. That's a sweet spot for me.
Amazing. I'm so much motivated right now. So you have worked on some huge projects like helping the British Gas to reduce cost by over 700k per year. And you currently work at ZOE, a brand that is kind of growing exponentially right now. How do you stay alert to new opportunities in a fast evolving field of design like we have right now? And what is your process for deciding which opportunities you want to pursue?
I mean, that's the $1 million question. How do you choose the right job and the right challenge for you?
Yeah.
I'd say there are a few aspects that I look at. First of all, this is something that has grown into me more over the past 3-4 years, which is the need for me to work on something that matters. Now, that can be interpreted. So let's go into it a little bit. What does that mean? Something that matters doesn't need to solve climate change. Doesn't need to put a man on the moon, right? I'm not talking that matters necessarily at that macro worldwide level, but something that matters to someone somewhere, something that makes a difference in their life. So between working on an app where you can create memes and working on probably the fastest growing healthcare startup in the world, there's no brainer there, right? Because I want to make a difference to people's lives. Why wouldn't I want to? And I know that this company, ZOE, for example, cares and that does a lot of good things and truly works on improving the health of millions. So why wouldn't I want to be a part of that, right? And that's one thing that I look at. One aspect that I look at is, will I get to make a difference in someone's life somewhere in the world, something that matters to me a little bit? That's kind of the first. I wouldn't apply to a job. I wouldn't accept an interview if that's not there. That's kind of the first bodyguard. Then the second one is you want to meet the team. You want to see who you're gonna be working with, because I've also have experiences from the past where I wasn't necessarily working on the most meaningful project, but I was doing it with great people. And that in itself matters. So I want to meet the team, but not only just meet the team. I want to get a vibe of how it is to work here. Tell me about how you work on a daily basis. Tell me about the challenges here. Tell me about what you're missing right now that you think I can come in and help with. All of these questions that sound so surface level, but actually when you dive in deeper and you ask why a couple of times, you get to really the core of how it's going to be to work here. And that for me is very important, because I'm going to spend 8 hours a day, at least 8 hours, I can tell you, at least 8 hours a day working with these people. I want to make sure that I'm having a good time doing it. So that's the second one. And the third one, which is also becoming quite relevant lately, it didn't used to be until maybe a year and a half ago, but definitely something that I care about is your company being run in an efficient manner? And that can mean several things. One of them, it can mean, is it run well financially, or will you have layoffs in 3 months? because your runway is 5 minutes? Is it run well from a leadership perspective? Do you have the right people in place? Is design seen as a mechanism that can help the business move forward, or is design seen as the cherry on top? Right? So all of these questions that are a bit more high level, but that will definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, impact your role in that company. I want to know that the company is run well and by the right people and financially stable.
I really love that because, especially with the state of the world with layoffs and things like that, it's just really helpful for people to begin to reassess priorities a bit differently. And I know it's an employer's market right now because there's just a whole lot of talent right in the market, but it's still worth taking that time to define what matters to you as opposed to just jump into the next thing.
Yeah, and if I can add an extra thing there as a caveat, because look, I understand I'm at a different place in my career than other people are, and maybe I can be a bit more picky with who I work for because I've been around, and I understand that not everyone might be able to do that. And what I would say, if you're earlier in your career, again, as I said in the beginning, in the first 5 years of my career, there was nothing I said no to. Even if it was work I didn't want to do, even if it was work by some people who maybe they weren't even going to pay me. Again, there's some red flags here. I'm just going to do the work, right? So look, there are phases in your career in which maybe you're willing to take a job that's not financially stable, but I'm going to have this for at least 6 months. I'm going to learn something, right? But again, different stages in your career, different things that you're looking for. And I would say another thing off the back of what you said there, that it's an employer's market. I think that's debatable. And I know loads of layoffs, right? I know this might sound controversial, but here's the thing. Most of those layoffs have happened in the States. So perhaps in the States, we're not competing with the States. We're in Europe. So yeah, perhaps in the States is an employer's market. We're not going to talk about that. But here in Europe, if you're listening and you're in Europe, there have been layoffs here too, of course. But I would say that good people can still find work. There is still work to be found out there. And if you're good at presenting yourself, if you have good work, you're not going to be on the street, right? So yes, perhaps you could argue that it's an employer's market, but that doesn't mean that you should not try. That doesn't mean you shouldn't put your best foot forward. And that doesn't mean that there are no jobs out there. There are, just a bit harder to get. The bar is set a bit higher. And you know what? I think that's a good thing that the bar is set a bit higher. Because you could argue that over the past 10 years, as design has become so popular, and the entry level was not entry level, the barrier to entry is so low, you could argue that the quality of design at some levels by some people hasn't been that great. So, I'd say there are still great opportunities out there for really good people.
I think the reason I say that is I've noticed a trend of more companies in Europe actually opening up to designers in the States. So there is that influx of designers in the States looking to Europe, especially for those that are based on the East Coast. So there's a bit of more context in that regard. But I do agree that there are still roles and it's not as intense as the States right now. And yeah, it's just more of just how you level up and present yourself.
For sure. And more than happy to also talk about that, because I think that there's really a lot you can do, a lot of small things. We were even discussing before we started hitting record, right? We were even discussing about small things here and there that you can do to just set yourself apart a little bit more. And I think that's something that we need to remember, is that regardless of how tough the market is going to be, you can still do something that helps you set yourself apart.
So what would be your recommendation then for people about standing out and approaching these conversations?
So I'd say there are a couple of things that you need to think about. First of all is, who do you want to stand up in front of? Is it a recruiter? Is it an employer? Is it a specific company? You got to treat it like a design problem. You got to do your research and figure out who your audience is and how do you present yourself best to your audience. Similar to how when you would make a couple of choices on a design, you would take all of those into consideration. So that's important. Start there. Then, honestly, the internet is so full of really good advice on what you can do with your portfolio that I think I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm just going to go just super briefly, but there's just so much out there. But first of all, first thing that someone who only has 10 seconds to look at your portfolio would want to see is, have you had any impact with your work? And here's what a lot of people misunderstand, and they get overwhelmed by this. Fair enough. Is that impact? I haven't touched conversion rates. I haven't touched retention. You know what? That's not the only impact you can have with your work. And if you have those, that's great. Those going to set you apart as well. But impact can also just mean things that are not necessarily measurable. If you don't have the measurable ones, then find something that's not measurable, something that's much more qualitative. Right? So let's say you worked on onboarding of a product and they didn't have analytics implemented. They didn't care. So you actually have no way of saying whether that's moved the needle or not. Fair enough. But you certainly have done some user testing or usability testing. I don't like to call it user testing, but you're not testing the user, you're testing the usability. So you certainly have done some usability testing. So qualitatively, you have proven that you can pass through this 40% faster. Or even if it's not, qualitatively, you have proven that the onboarding is just a better experience. Talk about that. Actually, if you really look into it, every single piece of work you do should have some sort of an impact, even if it's not measurable. So talk about that when it's about your portfolio. That's what sets you apart. Is a recruiter would go in there and would instantly understand that you understand that design is much more than just UI. It's about the business. So that's one thing, as a quick one. What we were talking about just before the podcast is the videos, right? Think about it this way. Put yourself in the shoes of a recruiter who looks at, 100 portfolios a day and just scrolls through them and has maybe 20 seconds for each. And you go through one, and you go through the next, and you go through the next. And they're all on Squarespace and they're all on the same design. There are 5 templates that everyone is sharing, right? All of them look the same. Everyone introduces themselves. I'm a strategic product designer. Everyone is the same. And then you, as this recruiter, stumbles upon something a bit different. A video. Someone introducing themselves with a video. In a sea of someone introducing themselves with maybe a picture and a headline, you have a video. There's a bit of a personal touch there. I'm not saying you need to do a video. My point is, what can you do that's slightly different than what everyone else is doing? Find 50 portfolios out there and draw patterns. What is similar between all of these? And do something different. And the idea of a video, introducing yourself with a video, came to me from that, also from looking myself through a lot of portfolios and realizing, they're all the same. Now, no one's doing anything different. So I like to introduce myself with a little video. It's also human. It's like you get to know me. Before you contact me, you get to know me. You get to kind of see how I talk and how I look. And, and I know there's going to be, you shouldn't put, there's bias and all. I get it. I get all of that. But at the end of the day, you need work. I need work. He needs work. She needs work. So you got to do whatever it takes for you to put your best foot forward. And I think introducing yourself in a bit more of a human way in your portfolio, I like that. I would instantly think of you differently if I would see that, right? In a more positive way. So those are a couple of tricks. But I would say, look, the internet is full of portfolio examples and all of that. So it's really not that complicated anymore. But what I would say is that, and the last thing, and I'll stop on this, is there's also a bit of disagreements as to what matters in a portfolio. Because if you ask some people, they'll say, no, we just want, just talk about the impact and just a paragraph about the work and show me some UIs. And then if you ask some other people, they say, no, I've talked about the impact and have a long explanation, a case study, right? So you don't really know who to believe anymore. So what I would say is just kind of take the best advice out there, something that makes sense to you as well, and just do your best there. Because naturally, you're going to find people who are not going to like what you do, but there are some people who are also going to be drawn towards your style of a portfolio as well.
I agree. Yeah, that's a good shout. Thank you for that. And now, so we know that metrics are important. We were just talking about how you show impact, right? But I think it's also just important to understand the actual metrics for people who might be working and don't even yet recognize that they're doing growth work, for example, right? It's also important to differentiate that sometimes there are vanity metrics. There are metrics that actually just on the surface level makes it look like things are happening, but actually don't move the needle. For you, how have you defined metrics in the projects or work that you do? And when you've worked with metrics, because depending on the scenario of the organization, has it been like a top-down approach, or was it something that you sat with a certain group of people, PDE, for example, right, to then define what the roadmap looks like? And how does that work?
Well, I would say it works in all of these ways you've mentioned. Again, different companies will tackle this differently. In some cases, design is much more of a doer, let's say. So it's more top down. It's being kind of given to you and you get the permission and the creativity to approach the problem however you want, but the problem has already been defined and the success criteria have already been defined. There are also companies in which design is involved much earlier into that process, maybe in an OKR planning session or in a strategic, maybe if there's a VP of design and that person will be in those strategic decisions of where the company is going to go in 5 years, right? So I've experienced all of them. I'd say the pattern that I see quite often with that is the success criteria will be given to you. Say more often than not, they're being given to you. And I think that's okay because there is someone in the business who knows what the business needs. Now, what I would say on top of that is it's very important for you as a designer or design team to also be able to propose and suggest. Because at the end of the day, you are the person in touch with the customer. So someone sitting super high up who hasn't spoken to a customer in 2 years might have some ideas of what could work. And they might very well be right, but they might also very well be wrong. So I'd say it's your duty as a designer who has the finger on the pulse every single day, talking to customers hopefully often, to push back and to say, yeah, perhaps if we do this, it'll work, but here's what I'm learning from these testing sessions, or I've done this piece of research, here's what. And oftentimes, if you're good enough at building those relationships, and if you're in a company where design is being seen as important, people are more often than not willing to listen and negotiate. It's often they go, oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah, interesting. Let's do the, And so I say it's important that it goes both ways. More often than not, I think work will be given to you. And again, I don't necessarily disagree with that. It is what it is. What also happens, and this happens quite often actually, is that work is being given to you, but without the success metrics. There's no criteria for success. This quarter, we need to redesign our homepage. Why? Well, we just need to redesign the homepage because it's old. Cool, but to which extent? What? Well, we just need to redesign. Those are conversations you often get. And I would say that's where you can really come in handy. To say, interesting, here are some proposals. I've done this research. I know people are struggling with this part of the home, but people don't understand what our product is. Could we redesign this homepage? So again, you work within their framework. What the framework is, I want you to redesign the homepage. But you propose and you kind of put things in that you know are needed. Could we redesign the homepage? But look, a lot of people don't understand what our product is. Should we redesign it and make sure that at the end people understand what the product is? Who will say no to that? Right? It's like, yeah, of course. And so that way you also help them define metrics. And at the end, you have something to measure. And you have something to go back to these people who've pushed the project on you and say, we've done this. Here's the actual impact. And once you do this once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, people will kind of get it. Be like, oh, okay, I get. Design can also help me with much more than just pushing pixels. So sometimes it's a bit of a long-term play. But yeah, I would say it really depends on what type of company you work in and how they're structured and how they see design.
Given that kind of example, right, where this is our goal, redesigning the website for this quarter, right? If you find yourself in that scenario and you're beginning to think about, let's bring it into growth design a bit now, you're thinking about experiments and things that need to happen within this context, and you can give us other examples, right? How do you balance the need for speed with maintaining quality? Because we must remember it's not just about pushing those experiments forward. You still need to ensure as much as possible that your prototypes are well aligned with what you're trying to put out.
So I'd say that's a question that really touches upon an important aspect of experimentation and growth design, which is speed is of the essence. And oftentimes we do things that are not 100% quality just to learn faster.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be that balance. To that, I would say that I wish I would have a bulletproof answer. I don't. So I'll just tell you sort of my thoughts around it, but I do not have a bulletproof answer to that. And I don't think anyone does, because really different companies work differently. You have access to different people. And so depending on all these different components of your environment and all that, your answer will be different. In some companies, you can do some things. In some companies, you can't. So I'd say it all starts earlier. It all starts before the experiment even begins. It starts with building good relationships. And you'll see where I'm going with this, so bear with me. If you build good relationships with people, they're more likely to trust you and be willing to go on your hunches and be willing to take your opinion as valuable, right? So then an experiment comes around and you design something and someone comes and says, look, we can ship it a week earlier if we just get rid of this small part here. And there you have 2 options. One of them is to say, hey, look, I've got a lot of research to back me up that this is important. We cannot ship without this because otherwise we're not shipping the whole thing. Or if you don't have that, you can kind of use those relationships and you can use the fact that you've done good work in the company and all of that to push forward and to kind of negotiate. It's all a negotiation process. I've heard from some developers that I worked with recently, I'm going to paraphrase them, but something along the lines of, rarely have I worked with a designer with whom I can negotiate. And I think that's just so important to realize that quality matters, design matters, and we're going to be able to push and pull a little bit, but design is not the only thing that matters. And when a developer comes and says, I can save a week of work by removing this component that updates dynamically, right? It's also down to you to say, do you know what? Let's be honest. How much does this really matter? Versus how much do I want it because I love it and I've designed it, right? And you can say, look, we'll do it without this component just to launch faster, as long as this goes in the next iteration. Right, so it truly is on a negotiation process. You're never going to win 100% of the time, and you're never going to lose 100% of the time. But there's still the question that I don't think I've answered fully, which is how do you balance, the speed with quality? And I say, I'm not sure it's possible all the time.
Yeah.
I've run in my career a lot of experiments that just frankly weren't at the level of quality that I would have wanted to ship something. And they doubled a number. So, yeah, quality matters, and I'm not going to ship something that truly is broken, but more often than not, the reality is that what developers will try to negotiate with you on is details, is small things, is can we hard code this versus having it update dynamically? It's small things like that. And the fact of the matter is, unless those aspects are a core part of what you're trying to test, those don't matter that much, okay? So I would say be willing to negotiate with your developers. I'm not saying let them step over you. If it's something that is really important to be in production, fight for it, make a case for it, bring data forward, bring user interviews, whatever you have. But if you're really honest, most of the time, it's small things that you can ship without and leave for a second version.
I was gonna say something to that you said because I'm always in those scenario, where the goal is just to build this thing fast. And when you're in the conversation with the team and you talk about trying to bait them to see the importance of these things, and developers just come with, oh, if we actually remove this, this component, we are going to build this thing faster. Most of the time, that wins a lot in some teams because you talked about building relationship with them and finding a way of probably in the next iteration, this will be released. But most of the time, in my own scenario, it might get pushed under the bus. Are there technical ways that you could push forward your point that, okay, this particular component is quite important?
Yeah. And you're right. There will be situations in which you know that the thing that they want to compromise on, it's uncompromisable.
Yeah.
And in that case, people understand if you make a case for it. If you bring a good reasoning to the table and you can show that spending that extra week of time is worth it versus not implementing it, yeah? If you can show how that thing is core to what you're testing, then most of the time people will be like, yeah, I get it. And here's the thing. People are not unreasonable. Again, most of the time, what people want to cut is small details. Details matter. I'm not saying they don't. But in a world where you have to move fast, when engineering is very expensive, so every week of engineering costs the company a lot, you've got to make that trade-off. Not even you, but a product manager might, or someone might have to make that trade-off. And you can talk about quality all you want, but the reality is that it's going to be very hard for you to win against yeah, exactly. So I would say there's something I heard recently, and I've been using this a couple of times with mixed success. I've heard Brian Chesky talk on Lenny's podcast recently. And he used this beautiful analogy of experimentation when it's done wrong. And he said, imagine yourself in your living room and you don't like your couch. So you throw the couch out and you go to IKEA and buy a new one. The couch is great. You sit on it, lovely. Oh, it's so comfortable. But then you realize that the couch works in tandem with the lighting. And the couch and the lighting works in tandem with the position of the TV and where the table sits and all of that. So yeah, you've A/B tested a new couch, but then you've A/B tested the wrong thing. What you should have A/B tested was the whole corner of the room. The couch, the light, the sofa table, and the flower in the corner. That in itself is something to be A/B tested, right? Not this one thing, because in design and in product, a lot of things usually work in tandem with each other.
Yeah.
Again, I've used this. Sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. It lands differently with different people. But I just love, as an idea, the analogy of, sometimes if you can explain that in terms that people understand, say, hey, look, this thing that we want to test now, let's say it's an onboarding flow, right? The onboarding flows are a great example. Oh, we just want to test this component on the third page of the onboarding. Oh, look, yes, but that goes in that the copy of that component was linked to something you said on the first screen, and it's like a narrative. And if you just switch this thing, the narrative is not going to hold well together. If you can bring those arguments to the table and explain why it doesn't make sense to test that single component, but perhaps we might test the whole page. Again, people are quite reasonable as long as you're able to put your reasoning forward.
Yeah. I would say I agree with that. That's definitely been my experience also, is on two things. One, the relationships aspect with developers. It is so vital. And honestly, it just makes your life easier. to be honest, to
And it
have
makes their life easier too,
and their
right?
life easier. Very true, right? It's just a win-win. Like, and I try to approach it as the business at the end of the day is what needs to win, right? That's kind of my mindset to it. I mean, when you're sort of like trading favors, and I use favors in air quotes. So it's like right now, this is the section perhaps that needs to be pushed forward. And maybe next time it is something that could be considered from a developer's perspective. And I think the one thing that we also can learn as designers is also that developers are not just there to build the thing. They understand a lot of context too, so long as you're able to lay that context
Yeah.
to them. So yeah.
I love that idea of trading favors. I don't like necessarily the trading favor. It's not that really, but I just wanted an example of where this good relationship has happened. I was working for British Gas, and I built really good relationships with my front end engineers. And time again, every time he would come by my desk and say, hey, this, I can do this, but it'll take a bit more time. Can we just scrap it? Time and time again, I was like, yeah, that's not important enough. For now, let's leave it to the side, right? You do that a couple of times. And then, I don't even remember what it was, but one day, there was this thing that I go to him with and I say, hey, I've designed this. I know it's crazy, but tell me what you think about it. And he's like, look, it's probably going to take a bit of time. Let me think about it. I was like, okay, I'll leave it with you. This was a end of the week or something like that. On Monday, I come to the office and he's like, hey, do you want to come by my desk? I want to show you something. I go by his desk. He's worked on that thing on the weekend.
Wow.
He's worked on it in his free time, not because he wanted to, but because we've built that relationship. Because I've done, quote unquote, and if people are just listening and they don't see this, I'm using the quotes, but I've done so many things for him. I've made his life easier so many times that he thought, my way of paying back is to make this little anime. I don't even remember what it was, an animation, something like that. My way of paying back is to do that for him. And if you really think about it, a relationship between you and the engineer, it's not massively different than a personal relationship you might have with a friend for whom you've done a lot of things time and time again. And then you call them and you say, hey, John, next weekend I'm moving house. Can I count on you to help me carry some boxes? Right? Of course, because you've helped me in so many other instances, right? Or the other way around. So think of your relationship with your engineers the way you think of your personal relationships. The better they are, the more back and forth you're going to have space for. Yeah, and that's really what it all comes down to, versus not having good relationships with them and everyone kind of being at each other's throats. Oh, no, but design is doing all these things. Design wants to. Oh, no, but engineering, they're just so slow. That's not great, is it?
No.
So, yeah.
I agree. I've got an example that popped into my head for that as you were speaking. And we'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding the entire website. It was literally me and this front end developer. And that process definitely helped our relationship because it was like just spending a lot of time together, like over 20 pages trying to get it all out within this time frame. And I recall that ultimately there was an arc. Basically, it was something really simple, well, from the design perspective, that had been imputed in the design. And I recall just like, hey, look, I know we've never done anything like this before, and I don't even know the extent of what you're capable of, but do you think this design is something that can work? And obviously at this point, there are times that he had come previously and said, look, can we cut this part out? And I'm like, it's not the best thing in the world after sliced bread. So yeah, sure, take it out. Right. And we discovered the extent of his skills basically with this request, to the point where even the principal engineer was like, whoa, I had no idea you could do something like that. And yeah, it's just those kind of scenarios just helps makes everybody's lives easier and just refocuses your attention on the fact that we're all working together towards one goal, making the business look good.
And to build upon that, on a daily basis, what are the small tactical things you can do? And I'll give a couple of examples. And just the other day, I asked one of my engineers, such a small thing that for most people probably wouldn't even matter. But I wanted to know how I could help. And there was this design with a lot of different pages, with a lot of different prices on them. And I said, do you prefer me in Figma to just write the actual prices? Or do you prefer me to put like a tag, tag price, instead of the actual price, just to put in brackets price. So then I know you pull it dynamically anyway. It's just such a small thing. It doesn't matter. But I know that you do that 100 times and you make their lives easier and they'll realize, oh, Christian actually cares about, which I do to the core. I care about my designs not being a pain for them. Do that a few times. Do that consistently. Be useful consistently. And that relationship will improve on its own.
Amazing.
Gosh, this has been so fun to get into
Yeah,
that with
yeah.
you, honestly. All right. So, can you share with us like experiments that you've worked on that did not go as according to plan and things just failed? I mean, because we know many experiments fail more than anything.
I'd say most experiments fail.
Yeah, true.
And that's by design.
Yeah.
Because you're taking a lot of risks with these experiments. And really, the goal of an experiment is not for it to win, it's for you to learn. So, as soon as you change your mindset around experimentation, you free yourself a little bit from the expectation that every single experiment needs to work. I would say 70%, if not more, of the experiments fail. But I've learned something from it. And I take that. An experiment is never done, even if it failed. Frankly, even if it wins, an experiment is never in a silo. You always do something with that experiment. Even if not straight away, you always build upon it. If it failed, you're like, well, what worked? Okay, let's tweak this couple of things, run it again. Do that as many times as necessary. If it wins, most of the time, sometimes people would be like, yeah, okay, it won. It's a good experiment. Let's put in the product. Let's move on to the next thing. Sometimes you might get a chance to have a second pass at it. So it won, but there are these couple of components that didn't do very well. Let's try to tweak those and see if it does better. So I wouldn't look at an experiment as a one-time thing, but rather I would look at an experiment as a set of experiments. So an example of an experiment that completely failed, sort of against everyone's expectations, were previously when I was working at a company and we were trying to get more people to subscribe. And we had this idea of putting a call to action to subscribe literally at the top of the homepage, because our hypothesis was the reason people are not subscribing is that we're not making it clear enough that you can, or we're not making it clear enough that you're missing out on all of these other things, right? Very valid hypothesis. So we put it to the test. We put this thing at the top of the homepage, and not only there was no difference in conversion was actually worse.
Oh dear.
And you think, well, wait, this doesn't make any sense. On the face of it, it doesn't make any sense. But then we started looking into it. Like I said earlier, every experiment that fails, figure out why it failed. We did some testing, we put it in front of people, we look at some metrics to conclude that the reason it failed is because people were annoyed at the fact that at the top of the homepage where they used to have all this content and they kind of had their ways of navigating around the app, we've changed all of that to put a call to action to subscribe. And they were just so pissed about that. And you can't measure how pissed off someone is, right? In a way. But I guess in this experiment you could, because conversion went down. So It was just one example of an experiment that failed. What did we do off the back of that? Honestly, I can't recall, but I do know we went back, we changed some things around, and then in the end, the metric has moved in a positive manner. But it was not the first time around, and oftentimes it's not. So if an experiment fails, it didn't fail, you've learned something. Go back at it, apply what you've learned, likely the results will be better. Maybe it'll fail again, but less of a failure, and continue that same process.
I love that. So, just speaking off of that and back to metrics, like, was there a project, for example, that there was a specific metric that completely changed the face of the project, like the direction, the outcome, and it perhaps surprised you?
Oh, so many. That's the interesting part, is when you run a lot of experiments, naturally you'll get some outliers that really go through the roof. And there's an example that I can't name the actual company, but I will give you a bit of a taster of the experiment, where our goal was to get people to allow for push notifications. So we wanted to be able to notify more people, but not a lot of people were giving us push notification permissions. We tried everything. We tried moving it as the first thing in the flow as soon as you sign up. We tried moving it a little later. We tried to put buttons in the app that would explain to you why it's good for you to give us notification permission. We tried everything, and none of it worked. Very frustrating, as you can imagine. So then we were off the rails testing something completely different, which was a streak mechanism. Nothing crazy. Streaks we know them from Duolingo, we know them. Yeah, they work. Streaks work, I can tell you. And we noticed how attached people were to these streaks. Again, nothing new, but we confirmed it for ourselves and our product in our own audience. And then the penny dropped. What people cared so much about was not to miss their streak. Wouldn't that be a great opportunity to say to them, hey, if you don't want to miss your streak, let us notify you. And you're not going to miss it. Very simple idea, but it took a lot of time for these different things to come together, right? And the results was an increase of high triple digits in percentages of people who would increase, almost 1,000% of people who allowed us to send a notification, which is truly unheard of. It's just a number that is just so outrageous. And you could say, the number was so big because we weren't very optimized before. Fair, but who cares, right? So that was a big outlier of my career, and probably just also such a crazy experiment, because All it took was to change the text on a button. That was literally it. It took change from a design perspective. Obviously, for tech, it was a bit more complicated. I just want to say, from a design product perspective, we changed the call to action, and almost 1,000% more people allowed us to send them notifications, which is wild. So, but I would say you're not gonna get those results ever unless you're willing to test a lot and fail. Amongst that experiment that worked really well, they were, without exaggerating, hundreds of others that were flat or failed or improved by 1%, which nobody cared about, right? So I'd say you gotta give yourself permission to test a lot. And oftentimes that's not necessarily in your control as a designer. And that's just the reality, is that if you work in a company where experimentation is not thought of as a viable way of moving the business forward, you're kind of out of luck unless you have a PM who is willing to side, again, building relationships, right? Build good relationships with a PM. They'll understand experimentation. They will, okay, let's do something. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've run experiments without permission, right? Shouldn't do, of course, but I have. And then you come back with the results and you're like, oh, wait, when how did this change happen? I don't understand. Oh, well, we ran an experiment last week, we just did it quickly, right? Again, I'm not saying run experiments without permission. What I'm advocating for is build relationships with the right people who will then help you run some of these experiments. Maybe a PM who has more pull higher up and you have a good relationship with him or her might go up and say, hey, we got to try this experimentation thing. Christian can't stop talking about it. He has all these examples. We've got to give it a try, right? So it's all about building relationships if you want to do that. And I would say there are some companies in which experimentation is thought of as risky. It is what it is. You're probably stuck there a little bit. There are some companies in which experimentation is the backbone of how they work, and that's great. In general, a lot of this will depend on the company you work for. And this ties in well with what I said earlier. When I look at what company I want to work for, I need to make sure that my ways of working and the beliefs I have in how design works align with them. And if they don't believe that experimentation is a thing that matters, especially in a growth role, we're not going to be a good match.
I love that. There are actually two questions that spawned in my mind as you were speaking. So first of all, with multiple iterations, obviously, and learning from experiments comes a lot of documentation. Right. Now, I'm curious, what is the level of documentation that you get involved with as a designer compared to like when you're working with a PM? What's that responsibility shift? Do you do your own documentation, or is it, okay, we've tested this? Who does the experiments plan, for example? Right.
Yeah. I'd say there are different levels, or there are different aspects when it comes to documentation. First of all is the documentation that engineers care about. Okay, it looks great in Figma. How do I build it? Or what's important here? What are the requirements criteria? What are the acceptance criteria here? So there's that documentation. In that case, I'm much less of a write it down type of person. I'm much more of be super clean in Figma and educate your engineers. So my engineers know everything there is to know about Figma. And if I go today and I say in 5 seconds, I want you to tell me how much padding there is between these two components, they'll know where to find it. That's because I spent a bit of time, recorded Loom videos just to show them in case they didn't know how Figma works. And then, I'm not saying that's the right way of doing it. I'm just telling you how I do it. I don't write a lot down. But to the side of some designs that are a bit more complex, I might write, I want this to happen, or I want this toast to be here for 3 seconds and then disappear. Or all of those are annotations, right? I annotate the designs, of course, but the documentation in the sense that we have everything written in a document or what, that I don't do any of that. So, and I would say the reason I can get away with that is also because I work with my engineers very early on. So it's very rare that I spring a design on them and they think, I don't understand anything about this. Like more often than not is they already know, and more often than not, they're already working on the infrastructure before the design is ready. So we're kind of working in parallel. And when you work in parallel, it's very hard to write documentation because what are you going to write documentation off the back of? And again, I could be wrong. Maybe there are ways. I don't know. I'm just telling you how I work. So for me, again, I'm gonna beat on the same drum. Good relationship with your engineers and bringing them into Figma and explaining to them and showing them how Figma works and all of that is also part of building good relationships with them. When dev mode was announced, and I nerd over Figma, for example, so I was like, oh, this is so exciting. This must be so good. I recorded a Loom video and I introduced dev mode to our engineers. And dev mode became the thing they were using. It's like they were like, oh my God, this makes our life so easier. Thank you so much, right? So again, it's small things like that you do on a daily basis that helps them as well. So yeah, that's part of documentation, is the documentation engineers care about. When it comes to experiments, at least in the past many years, I've had the fortune of working in teams where I had PMs. And more often than not, they have taken care of that in terms of just writing things down, writing all of these. So I don't do much of that. Obviously, I look at and try to interpret the data myself. So when the experiment is out running and we get some data in, it's often a team discussion. Hey, look what the results are coming through. Here's my interpretation, a PM might say. Does anyone disagree? Do we think this is fair? So I look over that data too to make sure that the PM has interpreted the data correctly. It can happen that the person hasn't. So in that way, I try to stay involved with the results. But in terms of documentation, in terms of writing up afterwards the results, so I've been fortunate enough to work with PMs who have done that themselves. I know that not everyone is, and if you're a designer, you have to do it yourself. I have done it in the past myself, but that's so many years ago, since I haven't worked with a PM, that it's probably not knowledge relevant anymore. Yeah, I would say the only exception to that is when it comes to usability testing. So I'll give you an example. At ZOE, we as designers run our own usability testing. PMs are not involved unless they want to be. Then, since we run it, it's our responsibility as designers to write up the conclusions, what we've learned, and the next steps. So in that case, yes, there is documentation for usability testing. But again, it depends on who's involved in the project. It depends on, is it testing? Is it an A/B test? It depends. But I think I write very little documentation. I try to find different ways of doing it, especially when it comes to engineers. Written documentation in a Word document is actually, they don't want that.
Yeah.
It's not great. It's not great of you, They just want to look at the design and kind of get intuitively how it works. And they know what each screen needs to do because we've decided already. We've talked about it. It's already built. They're just waiting for the UI. It's more like that. I really like including and involving engineers earlier on in the design process.
Right. So now moving on and thinking about getting ahead. My question to you is, what does a growth mindset? How would you define that? And for designers who might be listening to this, how can they begin to cultivate it if they do not already work within growth? And ultimately, even for core product designers, I can imagine a growth mindset might be something that would still translate into the work that they do. How would you recommend building that muscle?
So I'd say a follow-up question to that, to make sure I'm answering the right thing, is do you mean a growth mindset sort of in your personal life, or do you mean a growth mindset just within the realm of design?
Within the realm of design now.
The two are kind of interlinked, but I'll try to separate. I think we got to ask ourselves what a growth mindset is first, right? Is that you always having an idea in the back of your pocket of what could be better in your product? Maybe. Is that always thinking of the success criteria before you start a project? Maybe. I mean, it's just a growth mindset. It's so wide and it can mean so many things that I think first I'd have to understand exactly, what type of growth mindset are we talking about? I'd say, on a daily basis, if you are the gatekeeper of the product or sort of the last person whose hands the product goes through, because you might have a design QA as the last step, right? So you kind of give your last go. And you're the person who's talking to customers all the time. And you're the person working at the intersection of strategy and business and tech and product. Then it's fair to expect that you're also the person who always has an idea of how to improve the product. I'd say if you don't know how to improve your product, you're not talking to your customers enough. Because grab 5 of them and they'll tell you what's wrong with your product. They love telling you what's wrong with your product. So if you're out of ideas, if you don't know what to do, it's a bit of a red flag because there's always something to do. A product can be improved always. They say design is never done. That's because a product can always be improved. That's because the design can always be improved. So I'd say work that muscle of always knowing. If I wake you up in the middle of the night at 3 a.m., how can this part of the website be improved? We can do this because I know that in testing, every time we usability test this, people say the same thing, which is, I don't get what this means. Just an example, right? You always need to know how things can be improved. I'd say that's your responsibility, and on a daily basis, you should be thinking about that. Again, sort of on the example we were talking about earlier with when it's being given to you the task of we need to redesign the website, right? If at that point you have no idea what's wrong with the website or how it could be improved, what are you going to do? That's a bit late. At that point, you should already have ideas of, there are these 3 things that were in my phone, in a note somewhere that I've jotted down a few months ago that we can apply now, right? So work on that muscle of always knowing how you can improve the product and always push to improve the product too. When someone says, I'm not really sure what we're working on the next sprint. Oh, I know. Can I recommend something? There's this small thing on the checkout that we can change, right? Suddenly that's in the sprint. So always have something in the back of your pocket.
I love that. And then what are the common pitfalls that you see with designers in how they work? And now we're talking about like efficiency and how you can just overall improve the quality of the work that you produce. What are common pitfalls that you see?
I think some of these pitfalls some are worse than others, but I would say we're all guilty of them, myself included. At different points in time, I have done this. So what I'm going to say doesn't come from a judging perspective. It comes from a purely observational perspective, right? There are things that I also work on. I say one of the things that I have recently, for the last few years, started doing, and I like it, that I didn't used to do, is when someone asks for a problem to be solved, I used to solve it in one way and say, there you go, that's the solution. What I do now is I come up with 2, 3, 4, 5 ways of solving the same problem. I always have a favorite. I'll always come to you and say, this is the one I like the most and here's why. But it's just offering more solutions. Because if you think about what power design really has, is the power of visualizing words. You sit in a meeting and people just say words, right? And you take those words that mean something different for every single person and you put them in a visual. Now, the moment we look at it, everyone sees the same thing. Versus if it's just in my head and in your head, we all see different things. So design has the power of saying, here's what I've heard from everyone, here's how it looks like. And here are different ways of how we could interpret what you have said or how this problem could have been solved. Which one do you think? It's not like you're not asking for them to make a decision. You're saying, are we, especially in the early stages of design, are we completely off track here, or was this what everyone else was thinking? And I think if you do that, you earn a bit of the respect of people, because you don't come with this God complex of this is the solution, it will work. Because it's not like that, right? It's like, here are a couple of things that I've explored. By the way, copy, this is super early on. Copy is not even final. This is just a direction. We're riffing. What do you think is the right solution, right? So I'd say show several options. Show work earlier is another one. And I've been, and probably at times still am guilty of this, because as a designer, all you want to do is to show perfect work. Finish or close to finish or something. I used to think that I would go to a review, design review, and someone would pick at my work. I used to take that very personal. The work is an extension of me, right? So what I started thinking was, I don't want to feel that ever again. I don't want people to pick on my work. Therefore, I'll only show work when it's perfect. If you only show work when it's perfect, it's too late. So I've moved away from that. I've gotten over myself. And the reality is that people are critiquing your work and not you as a person. I've learned that. So now what I do is I show work quite early, and I might not show work that's too early to the CEO, right? There's a bar when you show a CEO though. But I might show to another designer. I say, hey, can I grab you for 5 minutes? I have this thing, it's super rough. What do you think? Yeah. Poke some holes into this. Show work earlier. And what you'll learn inevitably is that when you show work early and people poke holes into it, it will all the time push your work to be better. If I would have sat in a room by myself and worked on one problem, versus sat in a room by myself for a day, work on the problem, then show it around, then show it a couple more times and then work on that same problem, there's no comparison what the conclusion will be. So show more options, show work early. Yeah, these are a couple of ones when it comes to being efficient. And why am I saying efficient? Because you might say, well, it's not very efficient when you're just showing, instead of going ahead and doing the work, you're showing it around. It's efficient because in the end, you do get to a good result faster than if you spend a week doing the work yourself and then you put it a design review and someone pokes hole into it and you're starting from scratch again. So it is more efficient, it's faster. It also brings everyone else on a journey with you. Yeah. And when people feel like they were part of the solution, oh, this little button that is up there is because I recommended it. They feel better. They're like, I'm being heard. Christian is hearing me. Trust gets better. Relationships improve. It's all kind of like a circle here.
Yeah. I do want to now say that contextually, right? Because that is important to show work early. How do you balance that with, because when you think about a manager's perspective on the work, right? Is this to say that when you're showing work early, that includes your manager? Because, like you said, with the CEO, there's a certain level of bar that's expected, right? With your manager, what's the bar that's expected on that?
Here's the thing. The manager is a former designer. Or still a current designer, right? Depending on the structure in the company. The manager understands what it means to show work early. The manager wants to see work early. So if anything, the manager is probably one of the easiest people to show to. But I would say what's really important is when you show work, before you show work, give the context. What am I showing to you? What stage am I in right now? And what kind of feedback am I looking for? I oftentimes say, don't look at the copy. I don't care about the copy right now. Just look at the journey. Does this make sense as a journey? Does this sit in the product in the right place? Or should it sit further out? Or should it sit in onboarding? Or should it sit in checkout? Or what do you, right? Don't give me, I do not want any feedback on copy. When the copy is ready, I'll bring it to you and then we can critique the copy, right? But right now, I just want to, it's a wireframe. I just want to see if it sits at the right place. So I might come in and say that. I might come in and say, hey, Michael, or whoever you're presenting to, I've worked for a couple of hours on this rough idea that I have. I know it's super rough, so don't expect Apple level work, but I just want to critique it with you. I just want to see if you can poke any holes in it. So again, take it with a pinch of salt. Feel free to tear it all apart because it's super early on. Let me know what you think. So that's my one thing that I might say. Or I might say, hey, I've shown this to XYZ already. This is the feedback that I've got. What I'm going to show now is a more refined version. And what I'm looking for from you for is just a bit more attention to details. Like, what are there small details that I'm missing here? Because I'm kind of happy with the big journey, but is there anything I'm not seeing? Is there, to give them context of what you want from them. And once you've done that, and once you've eliminated the type of feedback that you don't want to get, then you only get the type of feedback that will help push your work forward.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I mean, yeah, contextual information. I feel like that's one of the tools, especially when you're working with stakeholders, to really learn as a designer, like providing that context and not just saying, okay, here are 5 screens. What do
Right.
you think? Right. Now, we're not bringing it into how designers grow their business acumen, right? And business thinking. I think we've established that already by now. Like, it is super important as a designer for you to understand beyond just what design is. And if you want to make more impact, understand the business side of things. What are the practical steps that you take or you would advise a designer to take about building that business acumen? For example, I remember a previous company I worked in, it would be going onto, we had like base camp, and we constantly had a full HQ section where every department posted updates. But more importantly, the CEO also gave updates on a weekly basis across the business of how the business is doing, right? That was something I always found interesting to read. It was almost like a digest where you can dig into each department or then read the CEO and you can understand how things tie together. Now, what are the practical steps that you would recommend or that you practice?
So I'd say I would give you the same answer that I'm about to give you if you asked me a lot of different questions about getting good at things. So if you would have asked me, how do you get good at design? Or how do you get good at prototyping? Or how do you get good at understanding business? I would give you exactly the same answer, which is, if you want to get good at basketball, how are you going to get good at it?
Play.
You're going to play. You're going to pick a few mates and say, hey, do you want to go and practice? You're not going to read a book about basketball, right? It's not going to teach you a lot. If you want to swim, you got to jump in the water and swim, right? So it's sort of similar, and it's a concept that I believe in a lot, which is, it's not easy, but it's simple. Put in the work every single day. If you want to learn about the financial part of it, in this case, I'd say perhaps reading a book makes sense, but my whole point was, what makes sense at a purely conceptual level is doing whatever you want to, just doing it. So if you want to learn about the business, maybe do a course online. There's so many free courses online, but just understanding the basics of how business runs. Understanding the basics of accounting. Because this concept is not chemistry. If you actually look into it and take a second to understand, they're very easy to understand concepts. And most of the concepts that we care about as designers, conversion rate. I have 100 people on the site, 10 convert, that's a 10%. Pretty simple. Retention. How many people are still with us day 7? They're quite easy concepts to understand. It wouldn't take you too long if you're really interested to learn. Now, obviously, if you want to go in a bit deeper and learn the full extent, that's something else. But I don't think as a designer you need that. So I'd say be interested and put the work in every day, whether that's reading a book, whether that's listening to a podcast, whether that's asking someone in the business, maybe asking a more senior designer who has a bit more experience in growth and understands magic. Hey, explain to me, what does this MRR mean? Oh, it's a monthly recurring revenue. It's how much money we're making every single month. It's just ask, learn. It's kind of what we talked about earlier with the growth mindset. If you want to get good at something, right, you just got to put the work in. So that's one part. The other part is sort of similar to what you said, is look around in the business and pick up what people care about. Very unlikely that the people who run the business care about the color of the logo. Very unlikely that they care about even how many research sessions, even how many usability testing sessions you've done this week. I don't care about that. What do they care about? Because the usability testing session is a means to an end, is a tactic so you can learn, so that you can apply that learning so you can get to an end. But what's the end? What do people care about? And in different companies, you will hear it straight from the top. They'll tell you, this quarter we need to improve our revenue. This quarter we need to improve our conversion rate. This quarter we need to improve our ARR. Pretty simple. Go Google and understand what it means. If you don't understand it, I'll give you a trick. You can ask ChatGPT to explain every single thing in the world like you're 7. Just say, explain the concept of conversion rate to me like I'm 7, and you'll understand it. But none of these concepts are too complex. But even if they're too complex, now there's a way to understand them, right? So see what the company cares about, and that oftentimes is a direction in towards what you should learn more about, and a direction into what should my design do.
Exactly.
It should touch upon that, because if you can, with your design, move the metrics that the big honchos care about, you're doing well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in terms of trends, right? Emerging trends in design and in code design. What are the trends that you've observed? And in your own opinion, how can a designer position themselves to be more valuable in these emerging trends?
Trends. Yeah. I mean, the idea of trends is something that's looking backwards versus what do you think will happen in the future? That's kind of what do you think is going to happen in the future, right? And we're notoriously terrible at figuring out what's going to happen in the future. So I'm probably just going to talk about what I see happening right now and not make any assumption of where the world is going, because I will definitely be wrong. So what am I seeing right now is a very focused shift in a direction of design being much more than just moving pixels around. You see, if you look at job descriptions, even for product designers, so I'm not talking senior, we're not talking lead, we're not talking staff, we're talking just product designer, right? That's 5 years into your career, maybe, depends. Even at that level, it's expected of you to understand some of these things about design that we've been talking about today. How can you move metrics? What can you do? How design works at a strategic level? All these things. You're expected to know this earlier and earlier. Again, I started stumbling upon this sort of work roughly at about senior level. Today, it's much earlier than. And I don't think that's going to change. I said I'm not going to predict the future, but I will. I think it's going to get earlier and earlier, because what's happening with design getting more mature, more companies are understanding, oh, here's what design can do. Interesting. Therefore, this is the bar now. Yeah. So the designers who are doing really good growth work today are setting the bar for the future designers of tomorrow who will need to do exactly that. So I would say a trend that I'm seeing from a lot of companies is from mid-level up, they're expecting you to at least understand how to move metrics. They're expecting you to at least understand the value of design. Design is becoming more and more important, but I would say that I don't know if design will ever be as important as some of these other functions that we work with on a daily basis. Will design ever be as quote unquote important as technology and engineering? Maybe, but I just don't see it. Will it always be as important as finance? Probably not, right? There are some staples of tech companies and companies in general that will probably always be there ahead of design, and that's okay. I heard this great story once about a janitor at a NASA space center or something like that in the 60s. And John F. Kennedy goes and visits that facility and stumbles upon this janitor and says to him, "What is your job here? What's your role here?" This guy says, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." And I just love that. The way he thought about it is like, I'm just a small part of this organization and we're all swimming in the same direction. Now, I'm not liking design with janitors, don't get me wrong. I just wanted to tell a story that I think shows and highlights a mentality that we as design, I believe, should be taking more of, which is we're all into the same direction. Whether I'm at the top or not so much at the top, we're all here for one goal, whatever the company's goal is. And I just love the humility of that. And I think design is not very humble. We want seats at the table and we're important and we're just, maybe, but also maybe not. So a trend that I'm seeing right now is, design is becoming more important, but so is everyone else. Engineering is becoming important. Product is becoming important. Security is everyone is becoming more and more important in a tech-driven world. We're going to grow with it as designers. But I'd say a bit of humbleness and humility wouldn't be too bad around this time.
Amazing. It's been a very wonderful conversation with you, Christian. And we've moved from different segments to discussing from your background in design, how you discovered growth design, job work, talking about metrics, talking about experimentation, talking about iteration, talking about the act of collaboration with engineers. I think we so much dread more on that. And we also talk about how to get ahead in your growth journey, talking about also the future of growth design. So I'm very sure this episode is really, really loaded, and I'm very sure our listeners will find it very, very useful. So moving to lightning round questions, I'm going to be very fast, and I want you to answer me very fast because it's meant to be lightning. Yeah. So what are the top 3 products you use daily and you love?
So I use the Whoop band and then the Whoop app. Loving it. I use Hey Email. I don't know if you know it. So it's made by Basecamp or 37 Signals. So I use that. And I would say I use my standing desk quite a lot. So those are probably three that come to mind.
One design resource you keep going back to always?
This will make me sound very basic, but I always go back to Dribble. For me, dribble is just so interesting and so good at getting the inspiration when you need it, and when you're stuck, seeing what others have done. Although a lot of the work on dribble has never seen a piece of code, right? A line of code, but you kind of know what I mean. I always go back to dribble, and I think it's a very underrated resource.
Right, nice. 3 books you like to recommend to designers out there?
Oh, to designers. See, you fooled me there because I thought it was in general.
Okay. 3 books you like to recommend.
Okay. I recommend Why We Sleep, Matthew Walker, one of my favorite books. I recommend The Obstacle is the Way, Ryan Holiday. And I would recommend Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand.
Nice. So what profession would you have become instead of a designer?
I'd either be a pilot or air traffic controller.
I like that. What's your favorite food?
That's a hard one. I have so many favorite foods. I'd say if you put a gun to my head and make me enforce me to say something, I'd probably say sushi.
Oh, interesting. What about your favorite movie?
It's years since I watched. I don't watch a lot of movies, so probably a hard one to ask. But what is my favorite movie? I love the Godfather trilogy.
Yes.
Shawshank Redemption is another. Shawshank Redemption is probably. I'll go with this one. Is Escape from Alcatraz, which is a very old movie about these 2 guys escaping from a prison in Alcatraz. Based on a real story. So these 3, I would say. Or there's actually, because Godfather is 3 of them. So these 5 movies are great.
Maybe Ini can relate. I don't do movies. I do only games.
I can recommend games too if you want. It's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing. It's been a wonderful episode with you, Kristen, and we hope that our listeners find this very, very useful. And what are your final thoughts in closing the episode?
Yeah, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I think it's very important I should probably have said this at the beginning, but take everything that everyone tells you with a grain of salt. Because the reality is that my experience is different than your experience. Your experience is different than someone else's experience. Yeah. So I might tell you a thing about how I think of my career that someone else might tell you the complete opposite of, right? Who's right? Well, there's no right or wrong, right? I tell everyone, just even listening to this conversation, these are my opinions. This is what's worked for me. Don't take this as the reality and the truth, because there's no such thing with some of the questions that we talked about is just opinions. And perhaps that's another thing that I've learned by hosting my own podcast is you ask roughly the same questions, but the answers are so different. And in the beginning, it used to confuse me. I don't get it, because I was kind of looking for the smoking gun, right? What's the answer? But the answer is that there's no answer. The answer is that everyone just has an opinion. Everyone has the bias of what it worked for them. And I think if you just look at everything you listen from that perspective and just try to take one thing from here and one thing from there, and build your own reality of what will work for you, I think that's a much healthier journey to be on than to just take everything that everyone says and then consider that being a fact.
Wow, amazing. That's a very brilliant line of thought. Everybody's opinion is kind of real to them. Don't take it as factual. Thank you so much, Kristen. We hope to have you another time on the podcast, if need be, and I hope that you'll be able to avail yourself for us.
Of course, I had a great time. So first of all, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to hear the episode, and good luck with the future episodes as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks, guys. See you in the next episode.
All right.
Thanks,
bye,
bye.
everyone.